Hi, and welcome to Executive Session, a regular discussion between the nonprofit Times and leaders in the nonprofit sector. Today, we're talking to Jonathan Reckford, President and CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. I'm Paul Clollery. I'm Editor-in-Chief of the nonprofit Times. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event, Donor Perfect. Donor Perfect makes it easy to do good without compromising stability or scale. They empower nonprofit staff with simple, reliable tools designed for measurable impact. Trusted by more than 75,000 nonprofit professionals, Donor Perfect supports smarter decision-making, stronger donor relationships, and sustainable revenue growth. Organizations using Donor Perfect average 25% more funds in their first year. For more information, go to donorperfect.com. Jonathan, it's been a while since we've chatted. How are you?
I am doing well, Paul. Great to be with you today. Thanks.
Well, you've been around the world lately. Give me the 30 seconds and give the listeners the 30 seconds on how things are going at Habitat.
So I would say the state of Habitat is strong, and I'm really grateful for that. We've had one of our actually best first halves, both programmatically and financially, in our history. So that's good. And yet, giant asterisk, the state of housing affordability in the US and around the world is the worst ever in terms of the gap between what it costs to create a unit of housing and what families can afford. So we're not winning.
So how much is the increase year over year?
So, in context, the big jump is not last year to this year, but from 5 years ago to now. So, what we saw really in the short version is COVID was really a perfect storm. In the US context, we underbuilt for probably a decade after the '08 crisis. The small builders largely couldn't get recapitalized, didn't come back in scale. And so we were underbuilding in the US context by several 100,000 units a year. Suddenly, COVID happens, everyone wants more housing, and the supply actually goes backwards. The supply chains get disrupted and messed up, and then all the inputs went the wrong way. Land went up, construction materials went up, skilled labor went up, and financing costs went up. So, to make it very practical, in a sweet market for us like Atlanta, Dallas, Tampa, Charlotte, Nashville, where we could build lots of houses affordably, that house that used to be $150,000 is now $300,000.
Wow,
That's a huge jump.
five
And
years. Wow.
incomes have gone up, but not nearly enough to keep up with the increasing costs.
How is world turmoil impacting that? Everything from the tariffs on lumber to everything else that's going on in the world.
I think uncertainty and volatility are just not helpful in every which way. And unfortunately, low income families suffer the most in all those circumstances. So we work in the Middle East, not in Iran or Gaza, but we work in Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan. And so obviously those programs are being indirectly impacted. But more widely, I think what we've seen is uncertainty on tariffs has slowed down decision making. I think we have seen just volatility increasing. Challenges, especially for low income countries. And now you're seeing the oil shock will disproportionately fall again as a regressive tax essentially on lower income families. We're seeing that right away in Africa and Southeast Asia, where imported oil is an important piece for them. But it'll show up in all kinds of ways in the US as well.
So you mentioned a couple of hotspots. How are you protecting your workers? Are they basically not working at this point, or are they just being very careful?
I'm grateful to say we're able to keep the work going. The most direct impact for us was Lebanon, where some of our staff actually had to physically relocate, and I'm grateful that they're all safe. But it's only been there you've got active fighting, so it's a big disruption.
So you've been on the road. You're on the road a lot, and recently you were at Davos, the World Economic Forum. What is some membership or at least attendance at an event like that? What does that do for Habitat and the overall scheme of what you're trying to do worldwide?
I'm really grateful that they scholarship a certain number of NGO leaders every year, and I think it's really important because the superpower of the World Economic Forum is their ability to create multi-sector gatherings. So it's a rare case where you can have heads of state and key policy leaders from the public sector alongside CEOs and corporate leaders. It's really important that the social sector and civil society be also in those conversations, and so I'm grateful for the chance. And this year, I was delighted housing was on the agenda, which has certainly not always been the case. And so I was able to moderate a session specifically on how do we grow the supply of housing. I also led a session on risk because insurance risk and fire risk, it was the hot topic, but we're just seeing more natural disasters and all the implications of those. And one personal favorite was able to moderate the interfaith dinner with faith leaders from around the world. And I think often we only hear the bad stories, but I wish everyone could hear the stories of these incredible examples of service and cooperation that are also happening around the world.
Well, you talk about service and cooperation going on around the world, but when you're in a room with the heads of state and the other well-muscled people from around the world at a place like Davos, can you actually put your finger on two or three things over the last couple of visits that you've had there that have made a real difference that woke them up and said, we need to do X, Y, and Z?
My experience of, and I've said this directly to the forum, what they're really good is at convening. They're not as much of a doing organization, but they can create the context where people who build relationships there can go off and do things. So I'll give a tangible example I'm excited about. We have a huge insurance crisis right now, and it's a global issue, but a big issue in the U.S. that directly impacts housing affordability. So we had policy leaders and insurance company leaders, and we had a great conversation about how could we actually reduce risk. And one of the things we're going to do with the forum and a group of insurance companies and other players is build more fortified housing, measure it, and show that we can lower the cost, and therefore the insurance companies can give lower rates. What we need to do is prove out that business case. So we're going to do a pilot of that together. And I think that's a great example where you really need a multi-sector partnership because policy is a big piece of it. Private sector is going to scale, but you really need the nonprofit world to be part of the design so that we actually design it from in a people-centered way.
Well, interesting that you're talking about risk because Habitat has a long history, at least since you've been there, of not building just homes or refurbishing homes, but building communities, going into food deserts, going into areas that don't have pharmacies, and trying to put communities together. How is all this turmoil, the interest rates, how is that impacting your ability to keep those communities thriving and building more of them?
We're certainly seeing a lot of stress out there. And I would say certainly something I've learned over the years, I know you've seen often, is one of the traps in our sector is that if we're housing people, we say housing is the answer to everything. If you're a health organization, health is the answer to everything. If you're food, if you're education. And the reality is we need all of that. And so, language we adopted a long time ago is we want to be a partner and catalyst for worldwide access to safe, decent, affordable housing. But we know housing doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it's connecting the pieces together. And that's actually slower and harder, but we're more committed than ever. So how can we either join with or help create the coalitions that can holistically think about coming alongside communities and making progress over time? One of my newer axioms is the only thing worse than partnering is not partnering. Partnering is slow, it's harder, it's messy, but it's the only way we can get to really complex solutions. And I would say if I can bring good out of bad, housing has become a bad enough, enough of a crisis that now every mayor and now most governors have said we've got to do something about housing because it's become an economic challenge as well as a moral issue. And so that's creating space for conversations that were probably harder to have before. But the good news for us is, for those who don't know, we work in about 1,000 communities across the United States. So we're, as well as in 60 plus countries. So we are local in all of these places and therefore have longstanding relationships. I think it's really then about how do you mobilize a shared vision for a specific community or sub-community. One place that makes a big difference that we're starting to see some bits of progress on is changing those 1980s zoning laws that were really designed in a way that helped unintentionally or sometimes intentionally create economically segregated cities, replacing some of the racial and other ethnic segregation that happened before that. What we're now finding is the parking minimums and minimum lot sizes, some of those 30-year-old policies are handcuffing the ability to build housing the way we ought to be building it. That's a great example of a community having to decide that together. And I do think where we can bring in other leaders, I've seen really great examples of long-term revitalization of some of these communities where you had that holistic picture. And I could tell stories, but I do think people are leaning in on those. I think the hard part is while private funding has held up, Public funding in many cases is pulling back, and there's no way philanthropy can make up for the gap in public funding. So I think we're going to continue to see stress.
I know around here in New Jersey, in Western New Jersey, the building is going crazy. I mean, absolutely everywhere there's a square inch of land, people are putting up housing. And of course, there's always an affordable housing element to that. But right now, we're seeing just rents going crazy.
Yeah.
Even in the new apartments that are being built on a major highway, along the strip of a major highway, you're looking at a two-bedroom for 4 grand a month. And
Ouch.
how can we talk about affordable housing when there are guidelines for people who to meet those affordable units that are available, but forgetting that for a minute, going to regular folks who are trying to find some place to live. How can we make that happen? How can
Yeah, it's a huge issue, Paul, and I agree with you because we desperately need all of it. And Habitat actually advocates for all of the pieces, even though our particular niche is affordable home ownership. And we really believe in that piece because that's really been the only way, if we have a society increasingly of people with assets and without assets, though we don't think a house should be primarily a financial investment vehicle, it is the long-term savings from home ownership have been the way that so many families over time have been able to come into the middle class and create an asset for their family. I would say to your point, we need more of all kinds of housing, and that goes back to how we design housing. In a place like New Jersey, which I think is the most densely populated state in the country, we've got to build more densely. We're wired that everybody wants a single family detached house with a picket fence, but with land prices where they are, that's just not realistic. But you're describing the missing middle. And what we are seeing now is markets where historically, a family with a middle class income could afford on a reasonable percent of their income to rent or buy in their community. That's really not true in a lot of places now. And the numbers you're talking about, there's no way a single income, even a dual income, moderate income family can afford a $4,000 rent. And so I think it's going to force us to do multiple things. One is just solve the math and how do we, if I can be encouraging, there's the biggest federal housing bill in at least the last decade, maybe in the last 20 years. We've now got two versions of it, but the House passed one version, the Senate passed a different version. We are personally pushing hard for a reconciliation, but we have interest. And it actually goes to your point. I've said often now that middle class families' children cannot afford housing in the communities in which they grew up, it's become a political problem. We already had an affordability crisis, but now it's become a political crisis. And I think therefore we might see action. And I think we need federal action, state action, and local. And it's going to take all of that to help kind of solve the math problem because what we're seeing is family can afford part of a house, but not a whole house. And we've had to get creative with things like shared equity, land trust models, what we call lasting affordability, where the family still owns the home, they can earn equity, but they don't win the lottery. And you're actually ensuring the city that that house will always be affordable. So the family there might be a deed restriction where they can earn equity, but they can only sell it to another income qualified family. Therefore, they get lower property taxes, helps with affordability, but it also ensures if a city's can allocate land that they know those units will actually be affordable long term. So I think they're creative solutions, but no easy ones.
no, you're not wearing a cap right now, but we're going to ask you to change caps for a second because you're talking about government and
Yeah.
government interaction with the nonprofit sector and building, whether it be financing or building or whatever. But you're part of the Leadership 18, which is a group of actually 21 nonprofit organizations that are the biggest in the nation with the most gravitas in the nation. And you're talking about government a second ago. Obviously, a lot of government issues are impacting the nonprofit sector, whether it be funding, whether it just be discussions about whether they should exist. The talk about the nonprofits, the IRS coming after nonprofits that they don't believe are nonprofits. What's the discussion within Leadership 18 these days? As you know, you've been in the room when I've been banging my fist on a lectern saying you guys are in every community, not just Habitat, but the Leadership 18 are in every community in the country. Why does there not seem to be more pressure from the largest nonprofits to fix some of the problems that we're having right now with government?
Yeah, no, it's a
Federal
great question. And certainly, we are proud to be part of that group, and these are the brands everybody knows in America, and all of whom are active in terms of trying to influence policy. I think one important thing for your listeners that I think is important for our sector is something I've said for years and years is at Habitat is we are political but not partisan, and I think that's a critical distinction because I think once a nonprofit becomes, and some that is their role to be partisan, but once you pick one side, it gets very hard in some ways to move things in a world where we know half of our country's on one side and half's on the other side. Even though I'd say on almost all of our issues, 2/3 of the country agree. It's just getting the politicians aligned with that. I think to me, what we've seen works best is relationship building and education and actually helping understand. I do think in Congress, there is more support for the nonprofit community largely than in the current administration. But even there, I think my general advice to people is don't pay so much attention to social media and focus on on the actual movements and what's going on. And I think some have been really tough, but I also am starting to see a recognition that, hey, if we claim to be for working class families from either party, this K economy is not working for half of our society. And so how do we start addressing the fact that how do we remove barriers? How do we open up access? How do we create opportunities for social mobility and growth? And that really is going to take pieces of all the things we've worked on. I think it goes back a little bit also to what I said, which is part of the challenge for the nonprofit community is one, collectively, we're big, but still tiny compared to the private sector. And so we don't have nearly the same financial weight. And two, we're so diverse. And I think that's a little bit of the challenge. So finding the issues where, the Girl Scouts and the National Council on Aging and Boys and Girls Clubs and the Red Cross can all work together is not always easy to find those umbrella themes. At the higher level, I do think it works. I think, we're part of Interaction, which is focused on all the organizations that do international development. And I think they're very focused, though obviously last year was tragically tough on foreign aid. I think our groups do better on things like tax policy, where everyone is aligned around protecting the charitable interest deduction. I think where it gets a little bit harder is the way Congress is organized. Then we start subdividing into all the separate different issues. So we're going to be very focused on the housing issues, but not so much focused on food. The food folks are going to be very focused on food, but not so interested in helping on housing. So what we've actually found is we have a process for where we all come together collectively, but we also make it really easy to find friends to work with on the sub issues, because there may be five of us that really care about housing, and we'll work hard together on the housing issues, but not try to force the healthcare people to work on housing, et cetera, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it's always been Habitat, yourself and your predecessors who were saying it's nice to have a house, but if you don't have a grocery store nearby,
Exactly.
what's the point?
Yeah.
So how can the links be made between the organizations so that local politicians, not just federal representation, but local
Yeah.
officials as well, understand that, hey, this pancake breakfast that we're now inviting you to, look at all the kids. Go to the YMCA and say, look, they're working on diabetic programs for seniors. How can the Leadership 18 enlist its members to get local, state, and federal people, representatives, into their communities? Because a
Yeah.
lot of them aren't even taking town halls right now.
I do think so multiple steps on that. One, I think for federal, we run a big Habitat on the Hill where we meet with hundreds of members of Congress in DC, but we always tell everyone even better invite them out to see the work in your local community, because that's really powerful. And I do think it's more important to get them out, and quietly most will still want to be visible in their communities and come out and have people see that they are coming and seeing what's going on. And I think that education process is super important. I think second is at the the national and global level, we can give permission, but those partnerships really need to happen at the local level. And so what's really important, and we do see beautiful examples of that, is that the United Way and Habitat and the Boys and Girls Clubs are all focusing in the same neighborhood. Now, Habitat may be building houses, Boys and Girls Clubs is doing, supporting the children, but collectively there's more impact if everyone does what they do in a concentrated way in the same places, and that's the simplest kind of partnership, and I've seen that be very effective. I'll give a favorite example. I'm a North Carolinian native, and this is an old one, but it just keeps on happening. We had a local Habitat affiliate that wanted to do long-term commitment to a specific historic African American community, had gone downhill for decades. Listening to the community, what they really wanted were two things. One, get rid of the crime. There was a big drug issue in the community. And two, make it a place that would be inviting for young families to move back in, because it had become a place where everyone escaped if they could. And this was a great example of just what you're talking about. The city got involved, all of the universities and community colleges got involved. They built a new charter school. Habitat committed to tearing down 16 in the first phase, 16 in the most dilapidated old houses, replacing them with new houses. Another affordable rental came in and remodeled some historically significant rental housing. Some private developers committed to coming in and rehabbing some other houses. And so it started with a 4-block area that then expanded out. And its crime was down 75% in the first 2 years. And then Habitat actually moved into the neighborhood. They've now built, I think, as of 3 years ago, they had built 164 houses. They extended the family training services to all the families in the community. You saw families starting to fix up their houses because they believed the community was going to improve. And you start seeing, it's intangible, but you start seeing change. And I remember the city manager told me, when I get depressed, I just do a slow drive through this neighborhood because it reminds me what's possible if you kind of get all the forces working together. And so I do think that is real. Now, I would add to that is we need that reinvestment in those historically underinvested communities, and we need to lower the barriers in the communities of opportunity, because one of the reasons there's pushback on community revitalization is it can create gentrification. And if families can't move into other communities, then you get stress. If we can have more mixed income communities everywhere, I think that's the best model for humanity. It's the best economic model, and it's clearly the best model for social mobility. I'll stop preaching.
So you're a North Carolinian. Where is Duke in your bracket?
Oh dear, I'm a Tar Heel, so this is a
Ooh,
really depressing year. I'm in mourning. My bracket is in flames. I never bet money because UNC always wins the national championship in my bracket.
there you go. So what are you doing for fun these days? What's your moment of zen?
So actually, catching me at a good time. 2 weeks ago, I have an annual trip with my business school roommates. We had a bunch of guys who've shared a house many, many years ago, and we all went skiing and just had hanging out and catch up time. So that was very cup filling for me.
Well, you're just lucky back then there weren't cell phones videoing.
It's very true.
A moment of advice for your nonprofit peers, your leadership peers. What should they be focusing on in the next? What tangible things should they be focusing on? Yes, there's the big theory that's going, but what a couple of steps that they should be taking now in their communities, other than talking to their peers.
I think there's a real mandate right now, given the volatility of the environment and, of course, the uncertainty now of the economic impact of the war, that I would say every nonprofit leader should be doing what I would call quick and dirty scenario planning. Do you know what you're going to do if things get suddenly worse? Because that's certainly possible. Hopefully it won't happen, but clearly possible. And having what we have found is if we've planned in advance, you can move much faster. You can be nimble and you're not surprised. So being prepared for a potential downturn, I would say cash is king, being really thoughtful about of trying to squirrel away some cash for flexibility, both because if things go down, the need goes up. And so having flexible, and I would say just assuming that the new normal is always going to be a high change environment. So strengthening your change muscles for yourselves and your teams to just be able to live in a high change environment because I sometimes see folks just get immobilized by the sort of magnitude of the changes coming at them.
Some CEOs at nonprofits around United Ways around the country were telling me that in their areas that people who are making $70,000-$80,000 a year and are just not making it because of the current inflation and everything else that's going on, prices going up. So the typical person you thought was going to be in need is still in need, but that's real. The numbers are really going up. Is that what you're seeing too?
We are, that there are places where, historically Habitat would serve families between 30 and 80% of median income. It's very difficult for us to serve at the low end of that range anymore because even if they didn't have a mortgage, and of course we are selling these homes, just the taxes, insurance, and their energy costs are enough that they could barely afford that. So without ongoing subsidies. So we are seeing a struggle, and we're hearing more and more stories of kind of the workforce challenges that, the teachers, firefighters, police, all those core essential workers are really struggling on cost of living as well.
We only have a minute or two left. I just want to take another minute to thank our sponsors today, Donor Perfect. Donor Perfect makes it easy to do good with simple tools and serious impact. Over 75,000 nonprofit professionals trust Donor Perfect as their fundraising success partner, averaging 25% more funds in the first year. Imagine what your team could accomplish with tools that are easy to use and proven to work. Go to donorperfect.com. Jonathan, where are you going next?
So I am going to where am I going next? I'm going to Florida to visit donors for a day as my next trip, and then DC after that. But this is actually an exciting time for Habitat. This is our 50th year, and so we're celebrating that. We just launched this week actually a more of an awareness campaign called Open the Door, and it's really helping people understand all the implications of not having housing in terms of health, education, livelihoods, and all the other things that we all want for our families.
Well, congratulations, and just stay out of Hartsfield.
It's not easy these days. I'm hoping I guess the TSA workers hopefully are going to start getting paid. That's a good thing.
Great. Jonathan Reckford, President and CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. Thank you so much. I'm Paul Cloler. I'm editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Times. Go to thenonprofittimes.com and read everything that's happening in your nonprofit world on a daily basis. Thank you for listening. Jonathan, always good to see you.
Great to be with you, Paul. Thanks so much.